Hey, everybody, this is Barry Mankin here with the Holistic Home Health Podcast. We're going to talk about fall. It's coming. We're not there yet quite, but it's coming. The temperatures are starting to drop a little bit here in Nashville anyway, and we're getting a little bit of relief. It has been nasty this summer. So we want to talk to you about some practical things that you can do to kind of prepare. All of these things are related to your indoor air quality. Basically, your outside influences affect the interior of the home. So we want to manage things both from a food standpoint and a water standpoint as it relates to mold, combustion, look at all of those things that we need to kind of prepare for so that we're not reacting in the wintertime. This is the same thing we talk about in the summer when we're coming out of the spring, getting into summer and preparing for the heat, right? So when we're going to be buttoned up that tight to be comfortable in those seasons, which we have all 4 seasons here, we need to be intentional in the downtime when it's fun. So when we typically have our windows open and all that sort of thing, we need to kind of be gearing up for that winter. All right. So let's just kind of give you a practical list. This won't be a very long podcast. We're just going to give you some practical things to think about and how you would think about those things in order to be able to have a successful winter and fall. Okay. So from an air quality standpoint, the particulates, they will increase typically. So depending on a few things. So if you, as an example, let's just start from an outside-in approach. This is what we always do when we're doing inspections. We want to do outside-in, top-down when we're thinking about water, and then, of course, availability with food sources or particulates. So that outside-in approach always starts in with your grading and your gutters, your downspouts, irrigation system management, if you have that. All of those things, if you have a negative grading toward the house, this is the time of year because, fall is when all those landscaper guys are out there. They're trying to get grass to grow. It's a perfect season for planting things. So if you can, look at those areas around your house, just do a walkthrough and say, hey, where can water sit? Where can water go into my foundation? Even if it's just level, it doesn't always have to be like an obvious spot, but think about what a hard rain does and whatever influence that is, whether that's a long slope toward the house or whether that's just a pocket. Maybe you have a dog and that dog dug something around the house and has this little spot that he likes to hang out in the summertime, right? That's got to get filled up with soil, non-permeable soil, so some clay typically. Thinking about those things in your landscape. Landscape areas are very vulnerable. We have you got to knock down your trees and your shrubs so that area behind there can breathe a little bit. Moisture sits in there, and you can't see a lot of things for a damage standpoint too. So nor can you see your grading typically. So clean that up really good. This is a perfect time to cut things back, and again, protect your house from what you can't see. Then looking at, caulking the windows on the outside, all the things we only think about energy, but in the summer, that house is trying to draw that moisture in from the outside. So thinking about caulking those windows, investigate those areas, have an inspector come out and just do an inspection on the home, look for these vulnerable areas, right? If you're in Nashville, you can have us do it. So 4 quarters, we would love to do that for you. But the idea is that, hey, we know that, we've got more water coming in the fall and the spring, typically, than any other season. B, we have temperature differentials coming into play when we get into the winter. So we're just kind of trying to be mindful and, again, preventative, which is our whole shtick here. So after we deal with things on the front end, and we don't want to be reactive anymore, that's no way to live with your house or your body. So if you can be preventative with your house and that envelope, that's where everything starts, okay? So, again, windows, double check all that. Look at all your flashing areas. Make sure that if there's something historically has been a problem, just deal with it, all right? Get it done before it gets worse. The grading, back to that again, you want to make sure you have positive grading away from the house. Your downspouts, a lot of times they're underground. Not most of the time, it depends on the house. But a lot of times they're underground. You don't know what's in there or not in there. And you don't know the direction of that water flow. Just because it goes underground doesn't mean it magically goes where it's supposed to. That's what a lot of people think. Out of sight, out of mind. But if you have a crawl space or a basement, or even a slab foundation in some cases, it gets into more of a settlement issue. But the idea is you want to get that water to dissipate at the end of that pipe away from the house to where it's continuing to leave. You do not want concentrations of water around your home. So, and that's all roof water. That's a lot of water, all right, especially on a hard rain. So, that top-down gutter guards, this is the time to get them in because fall's coming. So if you don't have some good gutter guards, and I don't mean like the ones with the helmets or don't spend like a crazy amount of money, but don't get cheap either. Somewhere in the middle, you can get a decent gutter guard, have somebody install it that knows what they're doing. And as long as you're not capturing things and it's sticking into those holes, typically metal is what you want. That's what I would go with. And having some fine grate on the top, but it has some type of a draw that can suck moisture in. So depending on the size of your gutter and the roof and what the pitch is of the roof and how fast it comes off of there, like all those things you need to be mindful of so that it receives that water quickly and it doesn't overshoot. So that's the main thing to be considerate of. But what can happen is leaves will get in there. It will go down the downspouts at some point if they don't just overflow, if they're not being cleaned. And then if those downspouts are underground, now those downspouts are just full of stuff. And then when it's full of stuff, it backs up because it can't dissipate. It doesn't flush it out, right? At some point, it just sets in there. And then it's back feeding, back pressure to those joints, right, where it meets at the foundation. And you're just, again, separating things under the ground, injecting things under the ground, or feeding up and getting that water, again, to put weight on that system and then also dissipate at that foundation, which goes right to your crawl space, right? So soil, downspouts, gutters, every day I see that stuff, every day. And this is like a practical thing to do, but never assume. All right, so whatever's underground, validate the integrity of any underground drainage system. Then, like for basements, you should have a perimeter foundation drain around your house. We've said this before. If you need camera work done, again, just get everything cameraed, valid in a locator where they can locate it and say, okay, dig right here. Typically, that's the simplest way to validate that integrity, okay? And then if there's a void, you can fix it. And it would be a lot cheaper to dig in one spot than just rip everything out and start all over again, right? So that's the value of getting camera work done, which we happen to do. Shameless promotion. With that said, you got to know. You don't know until you know, right? It's kind of like getting the numbers. Until you get quantitative data, you don't know. But in this case, until you see with your eyes, you don't know. So use that technology, those tools, those people that provide those services. And again, keep that top-down, outside-in approach. Keep the moisture away. Irrigation systems come into play with this. Most of the time, other than having more permeable soil, if you've got like a nice landscape or whatever, that nice landscape is usually in a lot of really good soil because everybody wants it to grow, right? However, the really good soil, if it's backed all the way up to the foundation like that, it's just receiving water. It's no different than some level of a French drain, right? Because right underneath that's going to be your rock, and that is a French drain. So depending on what's around there, if you have a perimeter foundation drain or not, and if it's working and if it's daylighted, so those are the things we have to think about. All these systems are designed to work with intention. We get too many hands in the cookie jar. You get the landscapers in there. You get the maintenance guys in there. You do a project. all of a sudden your drains are clogged, they're smashed, ripped out, and you don't even know it, or you bought the house that way, and who knows? Landscape looks good, but where does the water go? Always ask that question. Where does the water go? Outside of that, again, non-permeable soil behind that shrubbery, clean up that shrubbery, look at your envelope, deal with the drainage. This time of year, you're preparing to blow out that irrigation system, and then be mindful of, okay, did I have too much water? Because those plants really don't need that much. Okay, they need some, not a lot. Spray heads, lots of volume, okay? Rotary heads for grass, not as much, right? And there's levels of that. So talk to your irrigation specialist, whoever's doing that work for you, to say, what are my options just to give what I need, especially if I have mulch, which is going to hold moisture longer, and do I need to actually get some other junk soil behind my plants from that section between my house and my plantings, so that water, whatever comes to that area, at least starts to shed and starts to get away, and then give it a path to get away, or deal with your elevation of your landscape beds. So all of those things, again, where does the water go? And a lot of times in the package units, I'll see a package unit that comes from the outside through the stem wall of the house, the foundation. And if the water isn't directed, because you can't stop it, you can only steer it, right? So it's that whole wax on, wax off thing. You've got to have something. If you're on any kind of an incline and then your package unit comes in the wall, I see this every day, all right? There's a hole, the water's going to go to the hole. So whether that's going to infiltrate and possibly flood your HVAC and get into your ductwork or not, that's another question. I see that a lot too. But deal with your grading and protect those areas from influence, especially with moisture. So if you got to do like a little low wall and have, regrade a little bit to just protect those vulnerable areas of your home, do that with some practical landscape, okay? And then the irrigation, again, comes into play with all of that. Get that system blown out this time of year, and that way you're managing it, and then be mindful of when you're going to start it up. Make sure that everything's healthy. This is a good time for them just to do a startup. Just check it before they break it down and actually blow the system out. You can check for leaks. You can check for coverage. Now, things are going to shift in the winter a little bit with the ground, with the freeze and thaw cycle. But as long as you know you don't have major issues that you deal with on the front end, that way you're not hurrying up to deal with it when everybody's busy in the summer when you really need it, okay? So just, again, prevention. So let's stay on top of those things. And that way things are done well, and then, again, you don't introduce moisture. Where does all this go? Mold, right? So if we manage moisture around the house, it's a big, big deal. I have seen this year probably more than many other years. There's several articles that are out right now in regards to the temperatures and the relative humidity being a little higher this year than other decades in Tennessee. So look that up. We've had a lot of moisture in the interstitial wall cavities being held, whether it's a little bit coming through brick, the porous brick, or whether that's just some slight flashing areas that may not get direct water influence, but will draw air. So again, with the house being tighter, that air comes in and Tennessee comes in with it, meaning the moisture. So it comes in with it, and then that gets held in those wall cavities. I have seen that this year more than any other year that I've been doing this. So it's kind of like a tipping scale. We're already humid, and the house has so much resistance, right? Which, again, as we do energy, it's trying to pull it in harder, right? But the idea is that you want to keep your resistance up, you want to seal those penetrations the best you can, and you want to manage the inside. There's other ways to do that. We've talked about mechanical things and that sort of thing, but the principles are there, and this year was really, really bad. And so we've done more moisture mapping and infrared scans this year than I've done in any other year, just because it's inherent and people are smelling things in their outlets, which is where a penetration is, right? So you can smell that coming through there. And most of the time, they have the walls themselves, it's either drawing up from the crawl space moisture, which is available, again, from those outside influences, or it's just bringing humidity in through cracks, crevices, areas that maybe need to be addressed from a caulking standpoint or a sealant standpoint. So if we button things up and think energy, we're also dealing with water and when you're in a moist climate, okay? So let's talk about inside. That pretty much covers outside stuff, other than, when we get into emissions and that sort of thing, as far as the penetrations through the roofing and all that. But the other thing we need to think about is research, because we're talking about water, right? So water's mostly a problem for moist climates. However, we have all the seasons here. And so in the winter, you're going to have the opposite problem. You're going to be heating things up. You're going to be drying things out. So we need to be thinking about, hey, what type of humidifier, believe it or not, do I need in Tennessee or any moist climate area that's going to get a temperature differential that's going to be managed with heating sources, right? So I don't care what kind of heat source that is, if it's electric or whatever. If it's getting cold, you're going to have the opposite problem. So this is where that food comes into play, or particulates. So food for mold, but the other is, what are you breathing, just from an air quality standpoint, and what's on it? We've talked about this before. This is when that content raises up in the air. You get lighter buoyancy because the relative humidity is low in the house from the heating. Whatever history is in that house from a overall load, if you will, or biological load, and ductwork comes into play with that as well. Whatever's available is now lighter. It's just like blowing on that dandelion outside when it's dry. Poof, right? As soon as we start heating that up, everything that has been exposed to or has had any viability in the summer from a moisture standpoint now is blowing around, along with all those food sources that carry viral, bacterial, fungal content, whatever, on it. So we have to be mindful of how we're going to manage our particulates. Always starts with that deep cleaning that we talked about. We talk about that all the time. Deep clean, twice a year, right? End of the spring, end of the fall. If you have all the seasons, just do it. Hire somebody to do it if you don't have time to do it, but get it done. It's important, all right? So it's not just the weekly cleaning thing. It's moving furniture. It is getting all that stuff behind there because that load builds up. It's doing the tops of the doors, the windows, the blinds, vacuuming, HEPA vacuuming things like bedding. When you're changing sheets, get the dust mites out of there. All of that stuff builds up. And in conjunction with that, that's where the ductwork cleaning comes into play. At some point, we're going to have 3-in-1 duct cleaning in here. That's local. That's a company that we're involved with, and I'll give them a shout out. So 3-in-1 duct cleaning for Nashville, if you're needing that. But the most comprehensive cleaning, right? So is the concept. If one part of it is contaminated, and I mean the coil, the main lines, what have you, it's easy to open a vent and say, "Oh, that it's dirty." That could just be food falling in there, but most of the time, it's all the history, all the construction debris never got out of there from the initial construction or improvements, et cetera, because everybody wants to be comfortable when they're building stuff. It's nasty outside half the time. So, but it has to do with your overall percentages. That and the carpet, right? Those are the top two things that I see that hold debris, and that's available. So when you get in the house, you are the filter. So don't be filtering bad stuff. Get that stuff out of your air. Deal with the sources. And the sources for debris are always going to be those two areas, carpet and ducts. So if the carpet is being maintained and it has longevity to it, as long as it hasn't been influenced by major contaminants or anything like that, or certain areas or you got just too much history in there, get them professionally cleaned, right? So remove the stuff out of there. I can see on a particulate counter, whenever I scratch a sofa or carpet, they always are amazed to say, oh my gosh, that's in my carpet versus what's in the air. But when you have like kids or you bring in dogs, I mean, other than bacteria that they bring in and all the other things, the animals, will shed dead skin cells, etc., hair, all of that ends up in the carpet. And there has to be a maintenance regimen for our pets. There has to be a maintenance regimen for our history. And we have to be intentional indoors because we are stuck indoors, especially in those seasons where we're conditioning, like winter and summer, right? So we think about those things in the fall and the spring, not when we get there, because then A, we haven't budgeted for what we need to do from an improvement standpoint, and B, we're being reactive. And a lot of times we're spending bad money and just like throwing a dart at the wall just to put a fire out if there's a pain point, right? So all of those things are very helpful to manage the air quality. And if you want to make investments, it gives you time to make investments to say, hey, I want to invest in my HVAC. Maybe you want a centralized filtration system. Maybe it's time to upgrade that HVAC system, but at least it needs to be clean, period. So get the stuff out of there, and then how the stuff gets back in there every 5 to 7 years, right? Depending on the family and if you got animals and all that. How you keep your house, but if you deal with those things on the front end, you're going to be so much more preventative from a health standpoint. And if your house is healthy, you will be healthy. So manage that moisture, get the hygrometer. We talked about that in our top 7 thing that we did. Always get ready for that. Do all those top 7 things that we talked about on a previous podcast. And again, with this intentionality, it will help you being ready for winter. That's what fall is. It's being ready for winter and managing and the cleaning, right? So those particulates, this is where you start thinking about, okay, if you haven't already invested in purification, there's different levels and different ways to do that. I always say a little bit of offense and a whole lot of defense. So the filtration is the defense. Now, you should know by now, you're not putting like some high MERV filter on the front end of your HVAC furnace unless it is specifically designed for that application. And in that particular case, it's usually not a 1-inch filter. You're doing something internal. But for most homes, you're getting what I usually say is like an 8 MERV or less on the front end if you just have a regular wall register where it's going to be receiving at your return. And if that's where your filtration is, that's where you would do that. Anything else beyond that, you would have to have specifically your HVAC sized for that. So again, as long as it's clean, your level of filtration, if you're not adapting the system centrally, so the bigger the house it is, the more it makes sense to do something like that from a maintenance standpoint. The bigger the house, though, you get into all those other things that are centralized. So just know those are all big investments and very valuable, but you need a budget for them. Anything else would be outboard filtration. So other than being mindful, getting your load down, doing that cleaning, managing the outside, this is where I talk about fresh air makeup as well. When it's time to bring in fresh air more often than less in the fall, absolutely utilize that. You want to dilute whatever's been in your house, right? However, don't bring in the baggage with it. So depending on what the leaves are doing, depending on what the allergens are doing, depending on the time of day that you do that, a cross breeze through the house is great. Get that stale air out of there, get fresh air in. So healthy ecology, right? But just look at your numbers on your weather app. What's the weather like today? What's the air quality today in my area? And when is it going to get worse throughout the day so that you can know you can stay away from peak times? Usually when the sun is popping up and the dew is down, early in the morning, everything's kind of at bay. But then when the sun pops that up, it's drawing everything because heat rises. It takes moisture with it, right? Just like on the inside of the house, which is just a microclimate. You want to be mindful when you're opening windows, not just for comfort, but for debris. Because at the end of the day, whatever you bring in there every day, you're going to be stuck with in the wintertime. And then you'll be like, why do I feel terrible in the winter? Why am I sick? So again, be mindful. Let the numbers tell you what you want to do as a filter, if you will, for your comfort. So pun intended there, I guess. The other thing that we'll deal with is looking at prevention as it relates to foundational issues. So this is where you really need to think about, okay, what's my exposure in the winter and the rainy seasons with things like radon, with combustion. Those things definitely come into play because, again, you're stuck with it and you're the filter. So how much exposure do you want from these contaminants in the home? Formaldehyde, if you got spray foam insulation, VOCs, all the things that are going to kill you. So, but you can manage these things, right? Now, as it relates to some of these issues, when you have a combination of influences and they're all actionable as it relates to the levels that are available, you start to think about making some investments from a mechanical perspective. You start to call people in your local area that understand fresh air makeup and how that should be done with filtration and dehumidification, et cetera, depending on your area. You might get into ERV or HRV depending on, again, your zone that you're in. But down here, we like to do a little bit more dehumidification than an ERV. So all those things will come into play. And there's huge benefits to that stuff when it's centralized. But you have to be designed for that. So that's an investment. Anything outside of that gets into outboard filtration. There's some great filtration methods. We have stuff on our website too. But once you get into like larger spaces, some of those bigger units that have different levels of filtration, much like your water filtration, you're going to deal with some sort of a level of how good is the filter, right? So in this particular, it's just like permeability in the sense of receiving, but it's what goes through a filter. So that's where a MERV rating comes into play. That MERV rating, the higher that number goes up, the finer the particulates it catches. And as long as you're not restricting airflow on a system, on a centralized system, you can do that all day in a outboard unit that is designed for that, right? That, along with some air movement, some airflow within the house to, again, mix the air, will help, and your relative humidity, will help get everything to that defensive filter, drawing those particulates in, which is only going to raise as we heat the house. So other than taking care of sources so that you don't have that much available, it's what you just bring in every day. And general degradation of building materials and dust that happens in your normal everyday life. That's what that's supposed to manage, right? So that's what I call icing on the cake. And then, of course, there's smaller ones for different rooms, and we have all that stuff too. But that defense is huge. Get it out of your airspace. If finances are a problem with that, I've said this before, Corsi Rosenthal, build your own. And that is a very cheap method for people on a budget that not necessarily don't have the initial investment to make, or some of these filters get expensive. And so I'm not going to promote any or talk bad about any of the certain other ones either, but I see them every day. They usually come from the medical offices, and they're expensive filters. So, and the efficacy of that is pending, right? So there's better ones out there. That's all I'll say. But that defense is huge. You get those particulates that are going to be lighter as we get into the fall and the winter out of your airspace. Source control first for the biological load standpoint. Bring that down. Lungs of the home, clean them up. Outside influences, manage, isolate, seal packages, etc. And then whatever you manage on the inside, mix the air and filter out. And then to add to that, you can combine technology. So different types of ionization. And again, that's stuff that we have on our website. You can get probes, and that technology is fantastic. But in and of itself, it's more to do with viability. And you're going to get some efficacy as far as how it breaks down biologicals. But that residual, all that debris needs to be caught. And you want to either clean it up or filter it out. Okay? So those are huge for, what you're breathing in. Anything outside of that, you're looking at the other main source, which is always a path of least resistance. We have so many crawl spaces here, or basements, but mainly crawl spaces. And then, even from a slab standpoint, you get into the radon thing and all that too. So just so you know, we'll probably do a whole thing on radon, but it doesn't matter what foundation you have. Like, I don't care what anybody says. I have seen radon levels in basements. I have seen radon levels that are actionable, that needs mitigation in slabs, and I've seen it in crawl spaces. All the above, every age, doesn't matter if it's new or old, I see it all the time. It has to do with other things, which we'll talk about on a different podcast. But it's a combination of factors, always. So with all of that said, that crawl space or that basement has penetrations in the floor where wire comes through, where plumbing comes through, just the permeability of that structure. It's porous, right? So wood is porous. The cracks where everything meets is porous. The air is going to find, just like water, it's going to find a way, right? So, and with the stack effect of the house now increases, and this is the key part. We're heating our house, thermodynamics, stack effect, all of those things kind of like combine and say, all right, that heat's going to rise on its own. When that heat rises, you create a chimney in that house, basically. Everything draws, everything's pulling, right, from paths of least resistance. So if you can isolate those things or at least slow it down, you're going to slow the load that's available from non-desirable locations like the interstitial wall cavities or the crawl space areas or basements that may have stuff in there that you don't want to be exposed to, whether that's you're storing some VOCs down there, which you shouldn't do, and mold history because of the conditions, maybe weren't managed appropriately. But all of those things add up. So seal those penetrations, even your outlets on your walls. If you want to, see they got those little foam guys, but a thermal imaging is a good way to take a look and see where those penetrations are. And then we've done moisture mapping like crazy this year, but if you get a thermal scan on the house, that's something we can do as well. And that'll tell you where you're losing air, you're missing insulation, etc. There's always going to be something associated with it. If you typically have something like that, there's always a void associated with it to where things have to be sealed. Because it's kind of all or nothing. And that's the problem. Most of these houses aren't like perfect. And if they are perfect from a sealant standpoint, we don't have anything to compensate for that. We want balance at the end of the day. But when we're talking about influences, we want to slow down those influences. So seal those penetrations, either caulking, spray foam, etc., in the floor. So if you are getting an encapsulated crawl space, or maybe you just need to seal the floor up and put a better vapor barrier down, and then seal the vapor barrier. Again, radon comes into play with that, so you got to know your number. But if you don't encapsulate all the way up the wall and do the spray foam and all of that, fine. But it just depends on what you need. So again, every house is different, just like people. The principles are the same to be healthy, but every person needs different things. So you want to evaluate all of those things for what's coming up because the season's changing and most people just react to the pain points of whatever discomfort they're feeling or the colds they're getting or, all the viruses that come into play. But it's carried on particulates, guys. So at the end of the day, we need to manage those particulates the best way we can. And prevention is the best medicine. So let's think in terms of prevention, what we can do to button up, not just, you'll get the energy benefit too, but those other factors really come into play. And most of this is practical. We just don't do it. So anything else gets into the mechanical side, which we've talked about extensively. Carbon emissions, I'll speak to lastly. As it relates to carbon needs oxygen, right? So carbon dioxide levels as well as monoxide levels. I would encourage everybody to monitor those two things. Other than your moisture, get a monitor for those two things. So unless you're just going to get one of those overall air quality monitors, that is a good thing to know, especially getting into the winter and if you have combustibles. So if you have combustibles, it's 1-to-1 ratio on CFM when you're going out if you're venting something, right? So that air has to be made up from someplace. So other than the backdrafting that we want to make sure that we're not dealing with, you want to make sure that those emissions go out to the exterior and that the health of the flue is good. If you have a fireplace, same thing. We do camera scopes of those as well. And you can see the interior of a chimney and validate the integrity of that system to make sure that it's not cracked. Again, you're going to get carbon dioxide at that point, prevent some fires, etc. So making sure if it's gas that your pilot is, I typically say on demand, as opposed to just always running. If it's always running, you need to have that damper that is associated with that. Now you're going to lose a little energy, but it has to be able to draw, right? Otherwise, if the pipe isn't a certain height outside of your roof, look up the 3-2-10 rule on that. It has to have a certain height to draw and not be influenced by the wind against your roof line. Otherwise, you'll backdraft. And then you get carbon emissions, again, into the house. So if you're seeing like little black lines on anything, other than like getting rid of your candles and, plug-ins, which we've talked about, if you're seeing that what we call ghosting on the ceiling, if you're just not feeling well, if you're trying to heat with open flame, just don't do that. It's only aesthetic in these houses anymore. You would have to have a very drafty house that isn't insulated very well to be able to really use open flame, with like a fireplace, like an old cabin, right? That's when it works. Terrible for energy efficiency, but at least you're not dealing with some of those being stuck because you got the dilution and the makeup air for the combustion. This comes into play a lot on some newer homes. Combustion gets kind of tricky. The unit itself has to be clean. So getting a combustion analysis on all your appliances, another thing that we do. You can see how clean it is, how clean that flame is, and say, okay, does that need to be cleaned or does it need to be modified, adapted? Is it bad in the first place? Like, is there a problem? Whether that's your furnace, whether that's your water heater, whether that's your stovetop, whether that's your fireplace, any of those combustible sources, we need to be able to validate that it's healthy and you're not going to be influenced at a certain level of too much carbon monoxide. And the conditions have to be right for it to exit. Outside of that, the oxygen that it uses is a carbon dioxide issue. And the tighter the house or the bigger the family, the lower the ceilings, all that available oxygen now is going out. And now you're going to get headaches, feel bad just from not having enough oxygen, believe it or not. So again, other than mechanical sources, knowing what you're doing to compensate for using combustibles, okay? And again, when we're venting, it's 1-to-1 CFM. How to vent, when to vent. I usually tell people, especially these big hoods, as soon as you're done cooking, shut them off because that air has to come from someplace in the house again. All right. So making sure they're clean, get somebody to clean the systems, the fireplaces, get a company to clean that really, really well. Look at the orifices that the gas is coming out of, making sure that you have options from a ventilation standpoint, whether that's flipping a switch just to kick it on, you're turning it off the rest of the year. So if you're not using that gas, you don't want that flame going all the time. There's no reason for that. And just being careful with all of those things. Getting your system just checked for gas leaks once a year. Also a good idea. So other than cleaning that fireplace, all of these things you just have to be mindful of, okay? Yeah, I think that's it for today. So thank you so much for watching. Prepare for the fall, for the winter. Does that make sense? So everything that you do in the fall is a preparation for the winter. All right, hopefully that helps. Preventative maintenance. Thank you so much.